This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, I'm Preston Williams, and welcome to another edition of Jazz Talk. Today on our show, we have a very special guest. This gentleman has been on the jazz scene for over 35 years. He is a saxophonist, composer, and educator. He's played with so many greats like Dizzy Gillespie, McCoy Tyner, Herbie Hancock, Andrew Hill, and John Abercrombie, to name a few. He's also a wonderful human being. I've met him, so I know that for a fact. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Greg Osby. Greg,
All
welcome.
right.
Man,
Great to be here.
it's good to see you, man. I just, the thing that sticks out in my mind, I just saw you in January at Keystone Corner, you in Baltimore, and you had the coolest pants on. I showed those pants to Michelle Rosewoman. She said, "Yeah, that's Greg. That's Greg."
Yeah.
So those were nice.
Well,
But
I
listen,
think uh, jazz and creative instrumental music. A lot of
yeah,
the musicians overall, and the idiom could
yeah,
use a shot of promotional and presentation adrenaline, as I say.
uh huh,
Just in terms of embracing the aesthetic that our predecessors have
yeah,
laid out for us. I mean, they were always clean. They always were very concerned with presentation
right,
and the overall package, visual as well as oral.
yeah,
So that seems to have taken a back seat
yeah,
of late.
yeah,
Just a rampant overt necessity to be casual and comfortable has like thrown you know style out the window.
exactly. And we talked about the shoes too, because we had some shoes that were
That's
happening
right.
that year. You were saying, "Hey, man, that would be a good idea for cover album cover art or something like
Right.
that." So we
Right.
talked about it. But listen, man, we know you've been on the scene for quite a while. You've played with so many greats. Now, I understand that you are from St. Louis, Missouri.
From St. Louis.
Tell us a little bit about your humble beginnings, man, your upbringing, how you got involved in music, that whole thing, because that was a great scene. I hear a lot of good stuff about Missouri. A lot of great musicians have come out of Missouri. Tell
Right.
us a little bit about that.
Well, of course, St. Louis, based upon its location, being
Hmm.
smack dab in the middle of the country,
Right.
it was kind of a crossroads for musicians traveling either, far east or far west. And a lot of people, they came through there. They, uh, lent the city, their flavor, their regional flavor from wherever they came from. So the,
Hmm.
the city was kind of like a hodgepodge, like a gumbo of a variety of styles, tastes, and aesthetic properties. Also, St. Louis has its own spin on things. As most um, metropolises or metropoli are, where there's a convergence of a lot of black people.
Yeah.
You can you can almost tell where a person is from by the way they act, their swagger, the way they look, the way they walk, and the way they play.
Hmm.
And those affectations are very necessary, for the music to move forward. But
Hmm.
when I was a kid, on almost every corner in my neighborhood there was a bar, or we called them lounges and taverns, and
Right.
every one of those places had either like an R&B band or blues band or an organ trio, like a funky soulful organ trio. So
Hmm.
this was kind of like the sound fabric or the sound wallpaper, of my upbringing. That coupled with the idea that my mother, she worked at a record distribution company in
Uh-huh.
St. Louis, and so all of the major labels would send her company, the new releases or the promotional copies or the overstock. So she would bring home like armloads of records, vinyl, like every day of
Oh,
stuff that
wow.
they were going to throw out. So we had a record collection in all collections. And
Wow.
of course, that there was no digital MP3, so you had to stack things up on the record player back then.
That's
So
right.
the capacity was only for 6 records, but we would always have 10 or 12 records. So that was our playlist. And
Interesting.
a playlist for us, I mean, would be whatever she brought. So it could be as broad as some Beethoven or some Mahalia Jackson or some Duke Ellington or some Wilson Pickett or Jimi
Yeah.
Hendrix
Wow.
or the Grateful Dead or Aretha Franklin. It was like whatever she brought home. So
Mm.
that kind of contoured our thinking, to be very open and very accepting of a variety of different styles and different genres,
Mm.
without being critical or dismissive. So that really helped my ears before I even got into music officially at I guess in 1972. I started to play clarinet in the
Clarinet.
junior high school band. Hmm.
Mhm.
And then a
So,
year later, I got my hands on the saxophone, and that's when things really took off.
wow. Now,
Yeah.
as you just said, you guys were exposed to so much. Were there any influences that you, I guess, were listening to at that time that made you gravitate toward the alto sax? Were you listening to someone like a Charlie Parker or a Jackie McLean at that age?
Not yet. I
Okay.
mean, in around 1973, 74, my main guys were the soulful guys, the
Mm,
funky, Hank Crawford, Grover Washington Jr.,
right.
uh, Wilton Felder of the Crusaders,
Yeah.
um, Junior Walker, and
Okay.
of course, Maceo
Oh yeah,
Parker.
Maceo Parker. Right, right. Interesting, interesting. So you just developed from there, through high school. Now, in high school, were you playing any local bands in that area at the time?
Oh yeah, yeah. I was
Really?
kind of the funky cat, the funky kid, the skinny funky kid with the big afro. And I
Right.
played all over St. Louis, Arkansas, Tennessee, Iowa, Kansas, Illinois. In all of these funk soul bands. And back then the bands were very large. They were kind of like a review.
Mm,
Like with a full horn section, maybe
right.
two drummers, two guitars, three female singers, a male vocalist, percussion. The whole thing was like bigger bands. And I was, you know, 15, 16 years old in high school,
Yeah.
and all the people in those bands were like in their 30s and 40s. So
Wow.
I apprenticed, well, but I still, wasn't playing jazz yet until, I guess my last year of high school, when a cat in the band, he gave me a Charlie Parker vinyl. He said, man,
Wow.
check this out, man. You really have a good ear. You have a good mind, and, you
Hmm.
learn fast. Check this out. And from, it was, I was off to the races at that point because I had never heard a horn being played like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Bird was something else. So from then you moved on to Howard University. Oh,
Right.
wow. What a great school, man. I mean, so many fantastic musicians over the years have come out of there, from Jerry Allen,
Yeah.
Wallace Rooney, so many. Tell
Yeah.
us about your experience in college. Did you start to really get a feel for jazz during that time? Because I'm sure you were exposed to so much
Oh, yeah.
during that time.
Well, interestingly enough, I got a free scholarship, to Howard University, and the director, who actually is still there, trumpeter Fred Irby III,
Okay.
he was, ironically or coincidentally, he was the guy that put a clarinet in my hands when I was 12 years old, because
Really?
he was studying for his master's at Southern Illinois University. So he was teaching in the St. Louis public school system. So upon, getting his master's, he got a job at Howard University after
Hmm.
Donald Byrd moved on.
Yeah. Donald Byrd. That's right. Yeah. He went there
Right.
too. Incredible.
So he, upon graduating from high school, he said, I can get you in Howard. So that's how I wound up in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And
Oh,
the very first day I walked into the band room and I met Wallace Roney,
Wallace
I met
Rooney.
Gary Thomas, and I met Jerry Allen all at the very same time.
Oh, wow, man. That's
Yeah,
incredible.
we were all there. And so then I started to get my jazz chops together because, you know, there was a few clubs in town that, where you could play it. It was the One Step Down.
Yeah. One step
Uh,
down. Hmm.
there was a place called Pigfoot, another place called Connor's Jazz House or something like that. And they had
Right.
jam sessions. So I was starting to get my feet wet. I was still very, wet behind the ears and still didn't know what I was doing. But Wallace was a lot more advanced than the rest of us. So he was kind of coaching us. And we were the same age, but he, started earlier. So,
Interesting. Interesting.
yeah,
So from then on, you moved on to what? Berkeley College of Music.
right. I visited Berkeley during the spring break of my second year.
Hmm.
And when I got there, I went, I still had my suitcase and I went to a jam session that they were having in one of the ensemble rooms. And in that jam session, you won't believe, I mean, it was Branford Marsalis on alto, Walter Beasley on alto, Donald Harrison,
Wow.
John Toussaint, it was Terry Lynn Carrington on drums. Uh,
I think you just went out on me. I can't hear you, Greg. Greg, I can't hear you. Your sound just went out. Um, let's see here. Yeah, Greg, your sound just went out and not able to hear you.
Missions.
Greg, I just missed
And
everything. I just missed everything you said, man. Your sound and picture started breaking up. So like the last 20 or
oh,
30 seconds when you were talking, I didn't hear. We were talking about Berkeley College and it went out and then came
oh,
back.
okay. Um, no, I went to a session. Did you hear the names of the people who were at the
Yeah,
session?
I
Did you?
think Donald
Okay.
Harrison was like the last name that you
Yeah.
mentioned.
Donald Harrison, Walter Beasley, Branford Marcellus, Cindy Blackman, Kevin Eubanks, Victor Bailey, Terry Lynn Carrington. She was coming through. She was still in
Mm.
high school.
Wow. Yeah.
And so yeah, this is where I wanted to be, and I actually sat in on some of the classrooms.
Mm.
I said I'm visiting from DC. I'm just here on spring break, and so I got back to DC, and I got a call from the director of admissions,
Hmm.
who'd gotten a call from George Garzon.
Oh yeah.
He said, "Yes, this kid, he's visiting, and you all should like consider bringing him up here." And that's how I got there. They offered me a
Yeah.
scholarship to go to Berkeley.
That was
And I
fun.
said, I think this is a better environment because there's a larger number of players.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
mhm,
Wow. That's awesome. So
mhm,
after that, you moved to New York in the early '80s?
right. In
Man, so
80,
how did you get
82, 83.
83? How did you get to hook up and play with people like Dizzy Gillespie and McCoy Tyner? Wow, that's incredible. I mean, Dizzy's a
Well,
legend.
so I mean, when I was in Boston, I would take a bus to New York like maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks.
Hmm.
People wouldn't know where I was, or they just thought that I was being remote or whatever. But I was actually going to New York. I was sitting in on the jam sessions, and I would
Hmm.
go so often that people thought that I was local. That was my master plan. So when I
Hmm.
eventually and ultimately would move there, it wouldn't be like, yeah, there's this new cat in town. It would be like, oh, this is this cat we've been seeing at the
Right.
sessions.
Right.
But I noticed that there were a lot of players that that could play, but they were mostly in the Charlie Parker, Sonny Stitt, Cannonball Adderley mode. So
Mm.
I kind of had to fashion my playing so that I could be identified. And so that's what my thinking was.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so upon my last months in New York, in Boston, Dizzy Gillespie, his band played up there,
Wow.
and I sneaked into the dressing room, and I said, Mr. Gillespie, please pardon my intrusion. You can kick me out if you want, but I'm a big fan. If I could just shake your hand, that would be enough for me. And he said, "Oh, you're a fan." I said, "Yeah, I know all of your music." He said, "Oh, play something." So I took out my horn. I played a few of his songs, and I said, "Man, I know this is over the top, but if I could just play one chorus of just a fragment of a song with you, that would just make my whole life." And so he was like, he's smoking a cigar, blowing smoke, everything. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to call you out." And I was like, "For real?" So his band played a few tunes, and then he ushered me out on the bandstand,
Wow.
and or from the wings, and the whole audience went wild because those were all my people out there,
Right.
students, oh yo, and so he played a night in Tunisia, and I played the break, and I played one chorus. So then I bowed to him, and then I was leaving. Then he like tugged on my shirt and pulled me back and pointed to the mic and made me play some more. And
Oh
then
wow.
he let me play the whole rest of the set.
Oh my
So that
God.
was, I was floored. So this was a Friday evening, and then the following Monday, I got a call from somebody in school administration saying that we need permission to give Dizzy Gillespie's manager your phone number, your direct phone number. His manager called me, said Mr. Gillespie was very taken, with your level of respect and your level of reference and reverence, for the music. He's going on tour, and he would like to take you on tour. And I said, and so I said, I really can't do it, because I'm graduating soon, but give me a minute to think about it. And no sooner than I hung up the phone, I called right back. And I was biting my nails the entire time because it was a rotary phone. And it was taking forever to dial the number.
Yeah.
And so I just abruptly, just, just like you close shop up there and then moved to New York. And I moved
Yeah.
in with drummer Jeff Tane Watts. Well, he was
Oh
just Jeff
yeah.
Watts at the time.
I know Jeff. I just saw him not too long ago. He was in
Well, yeah,
Baltimore.
incidentally, he was one of the people at the session in Berkeley, when I got there, because he was at Berkeley with us, Marvin Smitty Smith,
Wow.
Cindy Blackman Santana. It was,
Yeah.
everybody was there.
Everybody was there, man. All those names. That's incredible. So you're in New York. How did you eventually hook up with Steve Coleman? And you guys were responsible for forming M Bass.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, I was playing at the Village Vanguard with John Faddis's band.
Mm.
Steve came to the Vanguard with Cassandra Wilson. They came
Yeah.
together. And
Cassandra
he
was
heard,
Cassandra was just on the show last
okay,
week. We talked about you too. Yeah.
okay, and he heard about this new cat in town, and
Mm.
so he checked out the set. And then after the club closed, we stood outside the Vanguard and we talked until the sun came up. Just he and I, we just talked about our aspirations and our hopes and dreams and goals and the state of the art, more or
Yeah.
less. And then went home, slept a few hours, and then we continued a phone conversation. We found that we had a lot of similar threads, in terms of career trajectory and you
Hmm.
know hopes and dreams, as I said. So so one of the questions that we kept asking ourselves and each other was, what needs to be done? What needs to push the music forward? Because it hasn't taken a giant step uh, forward progressively in terms of innovation and ideas and sound and style and
Hmm.
execution for a very long time.
Hmm.
Or it actually had, but because we were in the middle of this so-called Young Lions thing, the
Hmm.
heralding of Wynton and Branford Marsalis and Terrence Blanchard and all of us, we had moved to New
Yeah.
York and we were considered these young lions. It
Right.
was like
Right.
this whole new heralding of or acknowledgement of acoustic music and throwback, to more classic times.
Hmm.
And a
Hmm.
lot of record labels were soliciting us individually, to sign us because every label needed a golden goose to
Yeah.
match, this phenomenon of Winton.
Wow.
So I, much to the chagrin of some of the labels, I said, "Man, look, I'm not ready to, to be a leader to record. I'm still apprenticing. I'm still young. I have a lot to learn. But a lot of people they took the bait and they recorded prematurely, and those records didn't sell, and so they became, damaged goods. So
Wow.
anyway, so Steve and I, we did a calling around New York. We called a lot of musicians, in our age group that we respected, even some older players. And
Hmm.
we had a host of questions that we asked them. Do you have a personal style or concept or ideas that you would like to implement? And if so, what do you call it? And how did you come about it? How did you drive at your particulars and whatever? And we found that a great many of people were working things in private, but they weren't really executing them in public. And
Hmm.
so we just, pondered, amongst ourselves, like, man, can you imagine what music would sound like if people were actually, actively playing like what they're conceptualizing in their heads?
Right.
It would be like 1959 all over again. It would be like, Kind of Blue and Mingus and it would be Ornette
Right.
Cole, it would be Giant Step. They have all these musicians playing their music separate, and it would be a kaleidoscope of sound and properties in music, and none of them would sound alike at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, so that's when we decided, to constructively and methodically get together, once or twice a week in our respective apartments and work on music and to a great deal talk to each other, to have
Mm.
like an open dialogue, an open exchange of ideas
Hmm.
and concept, because a lot of things take place, after the gig, the hang, so to speak. When you can like find out what a musician is working on, how they think, the books they're reading, what philosophies they follow, ideologies or whatever. And then you learn a lot about the person, and through that you learn a lot about, their process.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Interesting. Wow. Now, I guess you're gigging or playing with different people at that time, and then you hook up with one of the great drummers, Jack DeJohnette,
right.
Special Edition. How'd you get involved with that? How'd you meet Jack and that whole thing come together?
Well, at the time, my roommate was drummer Terry Lynn Carrington. She had moved
Yeah.
to New York, and so we shared an apartment in Brooklyn. Everybody lived in Brooklyn at that time because the rents were dirt cheap, and it was, you know, easier to get to Manhattan than living way, way uptown or in the Bronx or way out in Queens, So, so at that point, she was working with everybody. She was working with Clark Terry, Dave Sanborn, Joe Sample, Stan Getz, Wayne Shorter, and and she was a protege of Jack's. She would go up to Woodstock, where he lived, like every other weekend, and hang out with him and his family, and and they would like practice together, and he would bestow, his teachings and his philosophies on her. So she would tell him about me, and so that's how that was going down. And so at this time, this was around 1985, when Jack he did a trio recording, a piano trio recording where he played piano.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was bass player was Eddie Gomez, and drummer was Freddie Waits, Nashi Waits' father. And they were playing at a club on Bleecker Street called Lush Life. And so I was playing at the Vanguard with, I don't know who it was. I don't know who it was. And so anyway, so in between sets, like I ran over there, because I had to run because it was like several blocks away. I had on a suit, I had my horn, and I went and sat in on his piano trio. Like for like a one tune. And then I said, okay, I'll see you later. And I left. And before I left, he said, hey man, if you want the gig, you got it, And so that's how I got the gig with Jack. Just from playing one chorus, one song with him in between sets. I had to run back to the Village Vanguard. And so then, so at that time, his band was David Murray, Rufus Reed, Howard Johnson, and John Purcell. So I replaced David Murray.
Wow. Because I remember even the earlier on when he started that group, didn't he have Lester Bowie in there too?
Lester was Lester Bowie, Bakita Carroll, Chico Freeman.
Freeman, yeah, he had
Arthur Blythe. He had some bad.
Blythe, that's right. Wow. Yeah. But when I saw you in January, this is one of my favorite albums. You signed this one for me, and I said, look at the young Greg Osby on the back.
Yeah,
that was a tight band you guys had, man.
Yeah,
all that stuff that Jack was, you guys were putting out was just fantastic. Now, as you're playing with Jack, I guess you played with him from '85 through the early '90s. How did you hook up with Andrew Hill, man? I mean, one of the great geniuses of, I guess, the last 50 years. I remember, I think you and I had talked about this. Alfred Lyon and Francis Wolff from Blue Note, they said they were three pianists that just knocked them out. And one was Thelonious Monk, the other was Herbie Nichols, and the last one was Andrew Hill. How did you get to play with Andrew Hill? And this particular recording right here, Eternal Spirit, man, when I heard you on here, I said, man, this sax player is awesome. Who is this? And I was like, Greg Osby. But tell us how you hooked up with Andrew.
Well, Andrew was he was living in relative obscurity on the West Coast. In the Bay Area, and then later on in Portland, Oregon. I think he was teaching there.
Yeah.
And I guess Bruce Lunvall, the president of
Blue Note,
of Blue Note, somehow connected, maybe through Michael Cascuna or whatever. And so they asked him, would he re-sign to the label, which was in full bloom at this point, because they resurrected the label in 1984.
That's right.
And so they said, piece together your dream band. So he got Rufus Reed on bass. He got Bobby Hutcherson on vibes.
That's right.
Who was on drums? Ben Riley on drums, and the 28-year-old Greg Osby of all the picks he could have had. He picked me. I was totally flattered because he was and still remains one of my great sages, heroes, and so we did those sessions at Rudy Van Gelder's studio, and so that started a really strong, mentor and protege relationship that we had, up until his passing, in the mid 2000s. We were very close. He called me the son he never had. I spent the night at his house many times. We cooked, we ate. We talked about music, or I just listened mostly and absorbed. And just some of the gems that he bestowed upon me are things that you can't find in any academy, any conservatory, any biography or whatever. These are things that oracles, are made of, soothsayers, the man on the mountain, just gems of information that I mean, I'm just grateful, that I was the recipient of this.
Yeah, yeah, Greg. I mean, tell you the stuff that he was putting out, like Point of Departure,
Mhm.
Blackfire, Judgment. I mean, the guy was really a genius. I'm
Yeah.
still blown away by his compositions.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, what a great musician. Now, what would you say, from working with Andrew? What do you think you learned from him, or what do you think you took from him, and what you've learned more than anything?
Um, well, one of the primary things that he would talk about, he would always talk about the raw materials and starting points.
Mm,
Um, and he would always say that you should vary, the incubation of every composition to the degree, um, that all of your music, has like a different, was representative of a different facet of a gemstone.
hmm
Otherwise, all of the songs are going to mirror each other. So he would say, start from the melody sometimes, or start, from the inner voices, or start from the bass line, or start from the rhythm, or start from some kind of chordal sequence, or some kind of motivic progression or something like that, but never be a cookie cutter, with your
mm,
composition. And
mm,
that resonated with me because I know a lot of people in my peer group, or a lot of people that I know, or students, or even people that I admire or have admired, for many years. A lot of their music, has this sameness to it now, which is great in terms of identification, but it's also a trap because it's reflective of a lack of progression in many arenas. So you have to be careful not
hmm
to, to walk in circles.
mm.
Yeah.
So tell us about Blue Note. How'd you get hooked up with the Blue Note Records? These two recordings here are two of my favorites by you. You signed these for me. Love both of them. This one especially. But how'd you get hooked up with the Blue Note Records?
But Blue Note actually hit me up when they, you know, resurrected themselves, But at the time, I was only 24 years old, and I said,
Right.
man, it was like 1984, and
hmm
man, I'm not ready, and I have a lot more seasoning, to do, a lot more road, adventures and more stories to tell,
hmm
and maybe I was a bit, I won't say arrogant, but just my thinking wasn't really centered. I didn't really want to be associated with a label that had that strong of an identity in terms of uh, style and direction and whatever. I thought that they would stifle my growth. I thought they would arrest my development if I was on the same label with people, that I wanted to be part of a more renegade faction. So I
I got
waited until I was, 27.
Okay.
1987, I signed with a small label based out of Munich, Germany called JMT. And they were
hmm
distributed globally through Polydor. So I still had global distribution. But that label allowed me to do whatever I wanted to do. I just
mm
delivered them my projects, and there was no label intervention. And so I wound up signing with Blue Note in 1989, and
89.
my first recording with them came out in 91. Because I was able to orchestrate a contract that also allowed no label intervention, no suggestions from the suits,
Right.
no producers and no people telling me what repertoire and what direction to follow or whatever. So,
Yeah.
and Bruce was and still remains, for me, a champion of the music. He was a true soldier, for creativity, for un you know, untampered um, expression. And he allowed me to do. He was like a big fan. He came to my gigs, whether it was my gig or not. Even if I was a side man with somebody else, he came and checked it out. He was a big fan of mine. We had long talks about music, history, art, fashion. He loved clothes, uh, wine, food. He was a great person.
Yeah.
And so I stayed with the label, from 1989 until 2005 or 2006. And it got to a point where the eclecticism of my recordings was so much that they weren't selling that much. And by that time, the label had already signed like Nora Jones and Cassandra
Exactly.
Wilson, and
Hmm.
people who were like selling in higher numbers. Diane Reeves. They'd signed Anita Baker, Al
Hmm.
Green, Art Garfunkel, um, Van Morrison, people who weren't even, so-called jazz or whatever. So I saw what direction they were headed in. Now, mind you, at this time, I was playing with the Grateful Dead and Phil Lesh, the bass player for Grateful Dead.
Right.
And
Right.
so they were like, man, look, you need to go indie. You need to go independent and get 100% of the returns on the label of the sales and this and that, blah, blah, blah. Because I noticed they were allowing people to tape their shows, and then people were trading the recordings and stuff. And I was like, man, isn't that like, affecting your revenues and, your bottom line? I said, oh, no. And in fact, this is Phil Lesh, the bass player, talking. He's like, oh, in fact, it actually stimulates sales because, these are our people. And the idea that we let them tape and trade, the recordings when we do a legitimate release, well, then it sells like hotcakes.
Mm.
So at that point, I put a whole, about 10 live recordings on my website. And so people
Mm.
could download those and download like live recordings, live sets.
Yeah.
And the response was so great that the server crashed. So
Wow.
that let me know that there was a demand, for independence and direct sales and things like that. So that's when, my contract ended, and now it's been written, that I was dropped, but actually I just said, listen, man, I know business. I know I'm not really selling, and I know you're keeping me on because you promised, that as long as you're here, I'd be here. But I don't, it's time to go. And another real reason was a lot of people on the floor, on the staff, I didn't know them at all,
I got you.
and they weren't even listening to jazz. It was just a business at that point. So,
Mm.
I've run my course here, and it was a great association.
You just brought up the Grateful Dead. That was one of the things that I found interesting about your career. So you hooked up with one of the members of the Grateful Dead, and then you started touring with this group called the Dead. Tell me
Yeah.
about that, man. How did that whole thing transpire? I found that very interesting. I'm like, wow, that's something interesting I didn't think Greg would do. But tell me about that, man.
Oh well, unbeknownst to a lot of people, I've had associations and collaborations with a whole lot of different musicians from genres that people wouldn't think were worthy of my involvement.
Hmm.
Um, from hip hop, to pop, rock, folk,
Yeah.
country. If it's interesting and there's a really healthy give and take, if I can emerge from these situations enlightened, or
Mm.
I felt that it was worth my time. You know.
Yeah.
So for the Grateful Dead thing, Rolling Stone magazine, they asked Phil Lesh, the bass player, they asked him, what's in his CD player right now, and he named, a couple classical compositions, maybe a Miles Davis recording, maybe something soulful, something Otis Redding, and then he said, and Greg Osby, and they're like, Greg Osby, he's like this jazz saxophone player. So, oh yeah, I find him very interesting and very engaging, blah blah blah.
Mm.
He talked a lot about it, and my publicist at the time, Brad Riso, he was like, an avowed, diehard Deadhead.
Hmm.
So he made the introduction. He took me to the Beacon Theater where Phil Lesh was playing, and
Wow.
so I played the show with them. And then from then on, whenever they were in the vicinity, he would like send me a car to come get me, and I would play the show, and so then, he called me for some gigs, and then that blossomed into some touring.
That is awesome, man.
Yeah,
Wow.
and through that association, I was able to play with some other rock stars,
Really?
rock heavies and stuff that I never would have, crossed paths with, and it's deep, when you get to see how people on the other side of the mountain live and how they operate.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not within the jazz aesthetic. Let me tell you.
Wow.
Yeah, I was shocked. Yeah.
Greg, something else that I was surprised to read that you were really influential in helping pianist Jason Moran, giving him exposure, and I believe you were on his very first recording on Blue Note, if I'm not mistaken, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I produced his first three recordings,
Ah,
and
okay.
yeah, and my wife, who at the time, she was managing him.
Mm.
He was in my band, and I told her to book his group, um, and so yeah, very instrumental in introducing him to the world stage. Took him to Europe, and was very, very supportive of he and a number of other younger players who I felt really needed, to express themselves, more broadly. And I thought a lot more people should be aware of what they were doing. It was a second wave of Renaissance in New York happening at that time. This
Interesting.
is like, the late 90s.
Yeah, yeah. Now, usually if you're just chilling or if you're at home just relaxing or whatever, what are you listening to? What artists out there capture your attention right now? It doesn't have to just be jazz, but who are you listening to right now and saying, this person's got a lot of talent. I like their sound. I like what they're doing.
Yeah, people would be they would be shocked at what I listen to, because a lot of it, again, I still have this multifaceted no no allegiance to any one genre approach to listen to
Right.
music. I mean this morning I was just listening to some Friends of Distinction and the Isley Brothers and
Yeah.
Fly the Family Stone,
I
stuff
like
that I
that
grew
stuff
up
too,
with.
man.
Yeah, you know what I mean? And yesterday I was listening to Chopin and Bach and a whole
Mm,
lot different chamber music. But as far as like some of the younger players, it's some amazing young players out there now who are playing at such a high level. I mean, it's mind-boggling, because they have a lot more to learn from. With the advent of the internet and
mhm.
instant access, and um, people are playing and sounding more mature, younger, faster, with more authority and more conviction than ever before. So,
Mm.
and that's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I could be, a moldy fig and sit back, and they ain't playing nothing,
Right.
be a crab, in the barrel and stuff, like a
Mhm.
lot of, well, not a lot, but like some of the older players were doing when we descended upon New York. Some of them were very welcoming, but some of them were not, because
Mhm.
we displaced them. But every successive generation is supposed to, um, you know, be reflective, of the advancements, in education and in execution. That's just the way it is.
Mm.
There was a whole legion of musicians that came to New York like 10 years or so after I arrived. This was like the second wave of the Young Lions. This would have been, the Christian McBride,
Mhm.
Roy Hargrove, Nicholas Payton,
Right.
Brian Blade, Brad Meldau, all those kind of guys.
Yeah.
They were playing really great. Then after them, came, Jason Moran and Stefan Harris and Mark Shim and
Mhm.
Nasheed Waits and Eric Harlan and all of them, they were part of that. And
Mm.
now, you have, other guys, Jaleel Shaw and Miguel Zenon and, Emmanuel Wilkins. And I mean, it's man, I could be here all day. It's some amazing,
Yeah.
bad young players. And, I'm as much a fan of them as they purport to be of mine, because
Mm.
I'm a fan of good playing and good organization
Mhm.
and heart. Not
Yeah.
people just, practicing on the bandstand and just ripping off all this technical stuff, but really telling um, profound stories that are memorable and, stories that are reflective either of their experience or of their dreams, or
Mm.
of their vision, the world according to them. You know what I mean?
Mm.
It should be like a sonic perspective, more or less.
Right, right. Now, of course, all of us are quarantined. No one is touring right now. But any projects that you're working on, or some things that you're thinking about, maybe composing, or some groups that you want to, get together after this is all said and done?
Well, I'm a serial composer. I'm a chronic,
Mhm.
uh, you know, detailer of everything that goes on in my head. So I never stop writing. I write a little bit every day, be it a snippet of something that's fully realized. Right now, I'm near completion of my latest project. I haven't released a recording in a number of years, because I
Mm.
have a record company. I've been dealing with that, and I've been touring a lot and both as a lecturer, as an educator, and as a special guest. And it's just been so encompassing and so involved that I just haven't recorded in a while. So I'm about 80% finished of my latest recording. We have to wait until this whole virus cloud lifts for me to get back into the studio and put the finishing touches on it. But I'm very, very proud of it. This is more or less my masterwork.
Fantastic. Well, Greg, listen, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. You're a hero of mine. Love your music, man. As I said, you've been on the scene for so many years and on countless recordings that I still listen to this day. But hang on for a little bit. Don't leave, but close us out here. And you've heard it from Greg Osby today. And as the saying goes, if the music grooves and makes you move, it must be jazz. I'm Preston Williams with Jazz Talk signing off. Peace.